Here we are at the February 2016 Pasadena Book Fair, sponsored by the Southern California chapter of ABAA. And our next interview is with Bruce Howard. And Bruce, I'm going to ask you, like I ask everybody else, give us a sort of like a thumbnail bio. Parents, what did your parents do? Do you have siblings? Are you married? Do you have children? Education, etc. So go.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Well, first of all, thanks for doing this. I think it's a great service to the association. I was born in Washington, D.C. Very unfortunately, my dad died when I was 2 years old. He was a real estate developer. And my mom was a single mom with a couple of kids and raised us on her own and was a fabulous mother and person. So she taught me a lot about books. She loved to read, and I think that's where it started, frankly. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., then she later remarried, and we moved to the New York City area, and I still loved books. And then I went to college at Yale, and then I went to law school at Harvard, and then I practiced law for many, many years, and I'm still practicing. So that's a big part of my life.
So you haven't got it right yet.
Still practicing, right?
So give us a timeline. When did you go to your educational places? When did you go here? When did you go there? When did you get out?
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm not going to answer so that you can tell how old I am.
I don't care.
If you want to look at him when you're answering questions instead of looking at the camera.
Okay, great. Okay, I went to Yale in the early 70s and then went to Harvard Law in the late 70s. And then I clerked for a judge. I taught law at USC, which is out here, University of Southern California. And then I went into private practice, and I've been in private practice ever since. My specialty is environmental law, and I help people with contaminated properties, making sure they're healthy and safe and can be developed properly with government coordination and oversight. So that's really my main thing. But I've always loved books. And going back to how that started, do you want me to explain the book
absolutely.
Interest? Probably my earliest memory with books was I must have been 5 or 6 years old. I was probably a nursery school kindergarten student, and I loved books, but I thought books were something you got in school. My mom was always reading books, but she didn't read to me really. And so for me, hearing books being read was a school thing, and it's one of the reasons I loved to go to school. So I would go, and I couldn't wait for reading time, and the teacher would read. And they were fabulous. I think for a lot of collectors and book dealers, it is based on reading. That's really the core value that develops into everything else. That's where it starts. So I was a great being read to person. And then one day I was going through a department store with my mom. I was holding her hand, and we were going past all the clothes and all this. And there was a bookstore in the middle of the department store. I think they had those in those days. Now they don't. But it was just like a Scribner's type store, something like that. Yeah. And so I looked at it, and I said, "Mom, is that a school in the middle of a department store?" And she said, "No, that's a bookstore." And it was an epiphany. I said, "What do you mean a bookstore?" And she said, "Oh, you can go in there and buy books." And I saw children's books in there through the glass. I said, "Wait, you mean you can own these yourself? You don't have to go to school and hear the teacher. You can have your own book." And I knew she had books, but I never thought of myself as owning books. So to me, she said, "Yeah, let's go buy one." And I remember with my mother going in and buying, looking through them all, browsing, which is a great experience, and then buying a book and having it and then reading it whenever I wanted, as much as I wanted. It would be a way to have time with my mother or time by myself, but just going on this little trip with this book to wherever the author was talking about. And it just had a major effect on me. I think that to me, it was the epitome of intellectual exploration and freedom of thought, that you could just open a book and you suddenly met a new person, and you'd meet maybe many people, and you would meet a new world, and you would think about it, and it would take you someplace where you haven't been before. So to me, that was about as good as it gets in life. And so I started reading constantly, and I got some great advice then from, I think it was a teacher, because I was a little embarrassed some of the stuff I was reading, like Hardy Boys, and it wasn't all Jane Eyre or something.
Yeah.
And the teacher said, you know what? Whatever you read is great, because it's what you do with it, it's where it takes you, but never be ashamed of what you're reading. Just read it because you love it. And so obviously I've gone all sorts of other directions. I partly studied literature in college, but I really took that to heart, that I think just reading is what's exciting, and it doesn't really matter specifically what you do, what special topic you pick, as long as you're reading. So I became a collector of books long before I had any idea that they had value as collectibles. I had no idea they had value as collectibles. I just loved the idea of going out in the world, exploring the world, and finding something that would be interesting to read. And so, for example, so I loved going to these dusty used bookstores, especially on the East Coast where I was growing up. And, you would just soak it in and you'd learn, and you would find a book next to the book you thought was good, and that book looked interesting too. And that was kind of like the early days of Google, where just exploring a shelf or a bookstore. So I was buying all these books, and then when I was in college, I went to a lot of the used bookstores at the Yale Co-op, which would involve a lot of the professors donating their books.
Yeah.
And that was spectacular, because a lot of times they'd have annotations in the margins. So you'd not only get like Homer, but you'd have some professor, and
or
some
scholar.
of these scholar, just making notes about it. And it was alive, it really came to life. So I was doing all of this, and finally, one day I was in a bookstore, and there was a paperback of Catcher in the Rye, and it had a picture of Holden Caulfield on it. And I said to myself, I love Catcher in the Rye, but I don't think I've ever seen a picture of Holden Caulfield.
Yeah.
And everything was pretty plain. I mean, even the hardcover that's so famous is a picture of the park, one of the horses in the park.
Yeah.
On the, but not Holden Caulfield. So I said, oh, I'm going to buy this, and I opened it up, and it said $5. I said, wow, 5 cents, that's a great deal. I would have paid 10 cents, because paperbacks in those days were like 25 cents.
Yeah, pretty much.
And this was used, so I thought it should be cheaper than a new paperback. So I took it to the front of the store, and the guy was very friendly, very polite, which I've always remembered, because I'm on the other side of the table now sometimes. And he said, oh, it's $5. Because I think I put a quarter down. I was waiting for my change.
The optimist.
Yeah, and he said, no, I'm sorry, it's $5. And, we all get this. We all hear this all the time. I said, $5? How could that be? It was just like a radical thought, because I had been collecting books for years. And he very politely explained what a first edition was. And he said, this is a very unusual paperback, because Salinger did not want his character pictured. He wanted the reader to imagine what he looked like.
Right.
And so when he saw this paperback, which I think was Signet, he threw a fit and said, destroy, don't sell anymore, issue it with a plain cover, which to this day, if you go into a bookstore, you'll see it with a plain cover. No more pictures of Holden Caulfield or anybody. And he also didn't want TV shows or movies or anything.
Yeah.
He wanted the reader to create it all in their mind. So I said, that would be fun to own. And so I kind of got hooked on the idea of owning something a little unusual, interesting. And so I paid $5. It was the first time in my life I think I'd ever paid more for a book than, you could buy it at a used store as a reading copy. So that was my first non-reading copy. And then I said, well, wait a minute, first edition, the next time I go back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, I have some storage with my books. I couldn't move them out here yet.
Yeah.
So I ran back there the next time I got back to Cambridge, and I rushed down to the basement to the storage locker, and I pulled out all my big cases with books, and I said, oh, I'm going to be rich. I'm going to find all the first editions I bought unknowingly back in the 60s. And none of them were first editions.
Yeah.
They were all just reading copies.
Yeah.
You know, interesting, great. And so that's when I realized that this whole first edition thing is a lot harder than it looks. You don't kind of like fall into it. You have
No.
to know what you're doing. So that's how I kind of got interested in collecting. And then the book dealing is my wife also loves books, and she said, I'll help sell them because we don't have room. It was more about the room in the house. So why don't we start selling some of the ones that you don't look at as much, and if you have a duplicate or something. Because I would buy a duplicate not knowing I already had it, and then I'd bring it home and there'd be already 3 there or something. So she said, well, why don't we sell some of these? I said, fine.
Good idea.
Yeah, so that she really started it. She started doing more of it. She's still the one who does all the day-to-day, and I'm like the official kibitzer, and I can still buy books as long as she sells them. So that's kind of how it all happened.
How long have you been married?
Oh, probably about, over maybe close to 34 years, give or take.
Children?
Yeah, we have 2 kids. They both love books. One of them's a lawyer working in New York, and the other one, the girl is here in LA working as a education foundation administrator. So she runs a group that helps with education, which has a lot to do with books too.
Absolutely,
Yeah, so they're both very interested in education.
What are your major specialties?
Well, it's very eclectic, I have to say. It's kind of whatever I'm interested in reading and whatever my wife's interested in reading, and she's always exploring. So right now we have a booth here at the fair, and we have incunabula, we have some great 15th century things, the first Aristophanes comedies, I think it's 1497 or something, by the Aldine Press in Venice. And then we have hypermoderns, like we love Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling. We still do a lot of children's books, partly because we spent so much time reading to our kids that just became a lot of what, again, a lot of this is an extension of what we read, what we read, what we studied, what we're interested in. But I'd say mostly literature, some history, Americana. My wife's from Europe. She's a child of the Holocaust survivors.
Yeah.
So that is a whole area of knowledge and study that we think is important. So we have some of those things too. Like
Somebody here had a folder full of Holocaust pictures.
Yeah, very important. They should make copies and give them to the museums.
They should.
Because, these are all going to disappear, and crazily there's debate about what's happened or what's true, and it's so obvious.
I know.
So I think anything that is firsthand evidence is worth preserving. So we've donated a lot of money to the Holocaust Museum in Washington.
I'm a member.
Yeah, it's terrific place. We got involved right in the beginning when all they had was the land.
Yeah.
But what land? I mean, it's
Yeah.
one of the best locations in the
You
world.
can imagine, yeah.
Yeah, so that was really fortunate. And then they have a Holocaust museum out here. I think they call it the Museum of Tolerance, but it's very similar in that it tries to preserve memories. And so, so we have books related to that also, like Anne Frank and
Yeah.
things like that.
Like Maya Kahan said,
Yeah.
never again.
Yeah, sure.
But, so let me ask you a further question about internet. Do you have a homepage? How much of your inventory is on the internet? And what percentage of your business comes from internet?
Yeah, we think the internet's very important. My wife worked with someone to set up a web page, rareantiquarianbooks.com. We have that. We're on a lot of the typical sites like ABE and ABAA and eBay and Amazon. And as far as how many of our sales come through there, I'd say it's a significant percentage. Partly because we don't really have an open store. I don't have time to do that, and she doesn't want to do it.
Yeah.
So it's really, we just, out of our home, we'll get emails, and she'll answer them, and she'll ask
Do
me
you issue
questions.
catalogs?
No, we don't issue any catalogs. Again, we're kind of trying to avoid the time pressure of all of that. We just don't spend a lot of time at it. So
But you're able to come out and do a book fair, which is,
we do, well, it's local, that helps.
well, yeah, of course that helps.
Helps a lot. And we don't have a lot of expenses. And, it's mainly just about the books. I just would, like today, she was talking to a customer, and they were really talking about what they want to read. And they were comparing authors, and you read this, and I think it's partly a way to find out good things to read that are interesting. Not just new publications, but
Right.
you can find something that was published in the 18th century you've never heard of. And so this collecting world, collecting is kind of a way of showing that it's still relevant, there's still interest, and why. And so we spend a lot of time just talking to people about what we have a reading group, and it has nothing to do with collecting, just, the reading. So, but no, we don't have a store, and we don't do catalogs. But we will, once in a while, we get a lot of inquiries over the internet, and we'll answer those. And we will, have relationships with people who will come back to us and say, oh, now I need this, or I want to give a gift, so we'll help people that way.
How many book fairs have you done?
Oh, probably dozens. No,
Just
not
out-
all ABAA.
Well, I'm just talking about ABAA stuff. In California only?
Yeah.
So you do San Francisco and LA.
Yeah.
You haven't ventured up to Seattle.
I went there once to shop. That was fun.
Yeah.
I just flew up for the day.
Yeah, it's a fun
Yeah, I went
show.
from the airport to I had a day off that day, and I thought this would be fun. I think it was a weekend, and I just flew up there. But I've never exhibited. We're not that hardcore. I mean, I'm doing it mainly to meet other people who love books, and she's she's doing it mainly because she wants to get rid of some of the books that are threatening to fall over. She doesn't want us to be hoarders.
Or clutterers. even.
Right. So I think that's what motivates her to keep selling them. And it's fine with me. Once I've read something or looked at it or played with it or learned about it, for me it's really about learning about the book. Like, for example, the other day I bought a Galileo, and I embarked on a little self-taught tutorial about Galileo. And I was reading all about him and came out of it a huge fan.
Yeah.
What a brilliant, historically important figure.
yeah.
People don't appreciate how important he is in the history of mankind, intellectual history.
Yeah.
And so I really studied him, but it's just because we found this book. And then, so that's kind of typical, that the serendipity of finding a book or hearing about a book or buying a book kind of triggers an interest in an area. And then we'll just pursue that.
Who were some of the mentors or people who you relied on as a source of information for you as you were matriculating into the business?
Mm-hmm. Boy, I think everyone has been so generous, and
Yeah, isn't that something?
people are really amazing. It's not a competitive business in that sense. I think that maybe there's just so many books in the world that no one really needs to compete over them. I mean, it's just everyone's very helpful. There's a real camaraderie. And yet people are very idiosyncratic. I think there are not a lot of company-type people. They're all individuals
Yeah.
that kind of like being their own CEOs. So I'd say Ralph Sipper was a big influence on me. He's a wonderful guy. He's also a great writer.
Oh, yeah.
And so I really appreciated the fact he was multifaceted. He was a great reader. I think I tend to gravitate towards those book dealers, the ones who really can talk to you about what they're reading more than what their inventory. The inventory is sort of an extension of the authors they love and
That's right.
they've read. And Ralph knew a lot of these authors. I mean, he knew Ross MacDonald, and
Oh, yeah.
and he knew a lot about Henry Miller. He read a lot of Henry Miller. So I think a lot of these people are very important. Otherwise, I think Mark Keim had a big influence on me. I think he's a real genius in this business. I mean, he's a creative thinker. And I saw his interview. Did you conduct that? I thought it was
Guilty.
fantastic. Great
I thought
interview.
it was a decent interview too, didn't you?
Absolutely. I think he really opened up and explained a lot of his thinking.
I've never seen him so free.
Right, me too. That just sort of surprised me. Kind of remind me of these photographers who get to the essence of a person during the posing. You know, I don't know how they do it, but somehow that just worked. In fact, that's probably the main reason I agreed to do this, because I saw how well you handled that with Mark and how revealing it was. But I knew parts of that already. I think it filled in a lot of the dots for me, but I think he's just a really brilliant guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think he was influenced by his father's business, Marvin. When my wife and I got married, Mark was very generous. He had us go over to his father's jewelry store, and we designed the engagement ring and the wedding ring, and they made it, and we could afford it, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't afford. I mean, he was like the jeweler to the stars.
Yeah.
But you know, they made a special effort to be welcoming to us because we were just fellow book lovers, really.
Yeah.
So he's always been very generous with me with his time and taught me a lot. I mean, I think I won't go into all the details, but I just think he had a different perspective that I think has proven to be ahead of its time. Only I think the time has sort of caught up with a lot of his ideas.
Well, yeah, that's true, but still, he's a very innovative guy.
Still, yeah.
His catalogs are always spectacular and different at the same time.
I mean, his are probably the only catalogs where I'll get it at my P.O. box and I'll open it and sit down in the post office.
Yeah, I sit down in the car
Yeah, and just
outside
read
the
it.
post office.
Okay.
A little chilly where we live.
So, I mean, they're just beautiful. They're works of art. They're beautiful to look at. I mean, he's a fantastic writer. I always wished he would write a novel or a short story. Maybe he has. I don't know.
I don't know.
But
He didn't say so when I interviewed him.
Yeah, but
though.
he's incredibly clever as a writer and also original. So, yeah, so I think and when I say he's an inspiration to me, it doesn't mean that I've gone on to write great catalogs. But, you know, I've just, as a person appreciating books, I think he's shown me how to appreciate them. And then I think Peter Howard was a great influence on people, more from the scholarly, academic area. You know, I think he really understood a lot about books. And, I mean, I could just name so many. You could probably go down the whole list of the ABAA.
Yeah, so you've gotten something from all of these people who have been in business for a while and are trying to explain to you this is the way to do it.
Right.
But you have to find your own way.
Well, you know, I just read a book by Bob Dylan called Chronicles,
Yeah.
and I loved that book. It was terrific. I mean, it's not a rock and roll book. It's
No.
a book about growing up and learning about your world, and he really emphasizes how, and he doesn't do it in a teaching you way. He does it just in a self-descriptive way. How you absorb the culture around you, and out of that comes who you are. But you just don't wake up one day and start writing songs. You are becoming a student of other songs, and they become part of your being, and then they emerge from you. When you feel like, he has a great line in his book saying he one day realized he wanted to sing songs that hadn't been written yet. He had an urge to sing these songs. And he had been spending his whole life up to that point singing songs that had been written by other people. But a real expert at that. I mean, he didn't just learn 5 songs. He knew
them all.
He knew them all. And
Yeah.
he knew the background, and he knew the reasons, and you know, he just was a real student. I mean, he would be a PhD in folk music before
Yeah, I agree.
So
Yes.
I think that's something I learned from reading that book. I mean, I already had a sense of it, but I think you have to really be a student of the culture around you and the economy and the politics and everything else before you really know what's going to develop inside yourself. You're sort of digesting that, and you're kind of like a funnel, funneling that through your person, your mind, back to the world. So I think I've always been very anxious to, you know, find these other influences, because I realize, and also I think it might partly be in my case because I didn't have a father, and so I think there was probably always a vacuum there of someone to kind of teach me.
Yeah.
And so it made me a little bit more interested in finding people out there who could tell me something. because I wasn't I mean, I got a lot from my mother,
Yeah.
but I wasn't getting it from the traditional father figure. So I think that was important to me, to be able to find people who could, kind of explain to me how things worked in the world. And the book business, I think, is just, I mean, in the legal field also, just filled with mentors who, and in fact, in my law firm, I created a mentor program, partly for that reason, because I think it's one of the key ways to help people.
I agree. It's
Mentoring is just, it's a sort of an underrated avenue for advancement. But a lot of it happens fortuitously, but it should really be something that you make sure everyone has the opportunity to receive. So.
Last question.
Yes, sure.
What do you foresee for our trade? Here we are, it's 2016, and in the next 10 years, things are going to happen. Do you see it as a positive or a negative going into the future?
Well, I mean, I think it's mixed. Overall, I'm not overly positive because, like I said, for me, I think the idea of collecting books is very closely related to reading books. So I think you have to start by just measuring the interest in reading before you think about extrapolate the future of collecting 20 years from now. So for example, with children's books, in my own case, I wanted to collect the books I had been reading as a kid. So Dr. Seuss. And, Dr. Seuss is still in print, but the books that influenced me, that kind of woke me up. And I think I still go back and look at them sometimes, and they're just, there's so much content. It's not just fun.
I know.
It's content with fun. So I think that I don't see people reading as much. I go into young people's houses, like my kids' friends, and, maybe they have a Kindle, but I just don't see bookcases that often. So I think that makes me worry about the demographics of this business, that a lot of the younger people are spending more time with social media and with, listening to iPods and whatever else it is. And they're not really just sitting down with a book.
No.
They have too much time pressure. They're juggling. The economy puts pressure. They're worried about paying their student loans and all that. So I think I worry about that. On the other hand, I think that with all of this digital transformation, I think there's an urge to get back to the physical substance of culture. Like, there's this movement now for vinyl and records, saying that vinyl is a valuable part. Now you can get digital music for everything.
Yeah.
People are going back to vinyl. Now, not in a major way, but I think that the idea that, let's say you've studied Aristophanes in school, and how can you not be blown away by, what he was doing at that time in terms of politics and culture and women's rights and just so many things. And then to say this is a first edition or this is a first I think that there's still, your skin still tingles when you see an artifact that is, the way the world first experienced this, that's now been absorbed throughout the culture. So the first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, or the first edition, everyone knows the movie, probably a lot of people read the book, but the actual physical object. So I think the way people might still collect art and still collect other things, I think an authentic artifact of a piece of culture that has, like Harry Potter movies and everything else, but there's still that first edition of the first book that came out when nobody knew who she was.
Right.
She was, a welfare mom almost.
Yeah.
And she wrote this book, and a lot of people turned it down. And there it is. So I think that gives you this sort of another view of reality that is worth collecting and appreciating and preserving. So I'm optimistic in that sense, but I'm sort of pessimistic when I look at the kind of sliding interest in, and I might be wrong about that, it's just my kind of anecdotal impression.